This is a map showing the Atlantic slave trade, meaning the extraction of slaves that went to the Americas. So it is thought that about 5 million slaves were extracted and went to the West Indies, where they died like flies and were worked to death. In Haiti, for example, where the great Haitian Revolution broke out in 1791 to 1804, leading to the founding of Haiti. And even though Haiti doesn't seem like a country that has contributed a great deal to world civilization, it definitely had its glory day in the Haitian Revolution, because there is no story of a revolution or a human struggle that is more lurid, with more lurid episodes than that. And it is a stunning, amazing thing that no feature film of the Haitian Revolution has ever been made. And the reason for that, I think, is quite obvious, but I will let you draw your own conclusions. Only 5% of this African slave trade came to the United States, a number of, amounting to only 400 to 500,000 original Africans, as enslaved Africans, came to the United States, to what is now the United States. And of course, they came mostly in the colonial era, but some of them came after that when the US had been founded. That was a very minor amount of the total numbers, and that's something that needs to be remembered. And then 35% that went to Brazil were up till 1880, because the slave trade to Brazil lasted longer, until 1880. For America, it was abolished by the Constitution in 1808, and even though there was a surreptitious smuggling of a few slaves after that, it really cut off the immigration introduction of new African people into the United States, pretty much. But in Brazil, it persisted till 1880. And in Brazil, there was even a substantial Muslim community that were involved in the revolt in Bahia in the 19th century, for example. So the Brazil took about 3.5 million original Africans, who today have contributed about 50% to the gene pool of the 200 million Brazilian people. Yes?
Was there also a gender divide? So I think I understood mostly female slaves going to the US and a lot of male in Brazil.
Well, that could be. Certainly in Haiti, 2/3 of the slaves at least were males that went there, and the males were taken and were considered more desirable and were worked to death, and then they brought new ones. And this is one of the pictures of the slave ship that was used to promote abolitionism. Here is a different map showing the African slave trade in general. And here you also have arrows coming to Europe and some going to North Africa, because certainly there was a Muslim slave trade. The Muslim slave trade never amounted to the almost industrial type of massive flow to the Americas that occurred from the European slave trade. It was never, ever as big as that in volume. But it lasted over a greater period of years, so that the total number of slaves who came out of Africa south of the Sahara into the Muslim world north of the Sahara was nevertheless very large over time. So the European slave trade was much larger, but the Muslim slave trade lasted for a longer period. Slaves were not caught by outsiders, unlike the portrayal in the Roots series, but were sold by local rulers who usually acquired them through warfare. It would never have done for Europeans, or for that matter, for North African Muslims, to come to a place and take people as slaves themselves. First of all, that would just be too hard to do. It would be too much effort. It would greatly increase the expense. And the whole slave trade depended on cheapness of labor, not expense of it. And so the way that the slaves were caught was by the rulers, the local rulers themselves, in their internecine warfare, would catch people, and they would do that because war captives often were viewed as enslavable. That was true in Europe. It was true in the Middle East. It was part of the Muslim world. It was part of the ancient world. And it was part of all of the pre-modern world. The country of Norway claims that it was the first place slavery was abolished as late as 1200. And that claim itself might be specious. After all, then Norway shortly thereafter lost its independence and became a colony of Denmark for 430 years, and then of Sweden for another 100 years. So I'm not able to evaluate whether that claim has any, holds any water or not. But the idea of getting rid of slavery was obviously an idea that developed only in Europe, among Europeans, a few Europeans, I might add, in the 18th century. And so while the abolition of slavery then went apace in the 19th century, it was also abolished in the Muslim countries in the 19th century, with very few exceptions. And so actually in Egypt, for example, slavery was abolished in 1854, and maybe in the Ottoman Empire, in other words, earlier than it was done in the United States. And so owing to that, no one can claim any moral high ground on this issue. The rulers who did most of the slave trade were non-Muslim Africans. But Muslims also participated in the slave trade, obviously. When the European colonialism arrived, it claimed that, oh, there are all these evil Muslim slavers we have to get rid of. The worst, most egregious example of that, of course, is the monstrous King Leopold II of Belgium, who connived at establishing what he called the Congo Free State in what today is Congo-Kinshasa, on the very excuse that I'm coming in to suppress the slave trade and so liberate the people. And then he went around having the people forcibly enslaved on his plantations to work for him, and having their arms and hands and legs amputated if they didn't agree to that. And there are all kinds of pictures of that. And of course, there's that book by Adam Hochschild, is it, the King Leopold's Ghost, about the awfulness of this. And it was so terrible that it was already discovered in the around 1900 and started to be promoted in the newspapers as an atrocity, so that King Leopold had to give up the Congo Free State in 1908 and then died under a cloud in 1909, still King of Belgium, however, in a state of abject humiliation because of the evil of it all. So the Europeans, when they moved in, often hypocritically adopted the idea, oh, we're preventing slavery, and then they connived at it. So that's how slavery continued in Zanzibar under the British for a longer time, on the excuse, oh, well, this is only a protectorate, a British protectorate, and so the Sultan is really responsible for this, and we have no responsibility, even though it was British companies that were invested in the clove plantations on Zanzibar and Pemba. So there's a lot of hypocritical talk coming from the sides of European colonialism, who resented also the idea that anybody else should be enslaving the others. We should have the exclusive rights to enslave everybody. And that's not to justify the side of Muslim practice that had slavery in it.